work into the column store indexes, basically the data which is stored in a row group, also the column segment. So the row group is nothing but a group of rows that we can compress into the column store format. And so for example, if you have a rows like which is 1 million rows, so then when you enter the data into the column store indexes, which is basically all the rows which is compressed and group that into the particular row group. So the another advantage in column store index is when you create an index on the particular rows, that rows will be compressed, which is advantage to storage data, because if you have 100 gig of data, it will compress into 10 times and then it will store the data. So when you do the compressed onto the column store indexes, every time particular number of row groups, you can see the count here, 1,048,566 rows, and so these are the rows you can maximum apply to the row group. So as soon as if you insert the data into the column store indexes or existing data, you create a column store index. So by default it will create rows and compressed into the group which is called as a row group. So every column store indexes by default it will create a row group. So each row group can have a maximum of these many rows. So you can see basically these are the let's assume these are your rows. So when you do the any column store indexes, it will compress the data as a row group, and each row group which is contain the column segment. So the column segment is like when you enter the data which is storing into the column store. So when we enter the data into the column store indexes, so the row group which will create insert the data with the compressed. So when we compress the data in the row group required to store the data in order. So each row group by default it will contain one column segment. So the column segment is that the column of the data from that particular row group. So each row group will contain the column segment, and the column segment will define the column of the data in the compressed. So when you work with any column store indexes, so each row group, that row group will have a compressed data inside of the row group which will contain the column segment. That particular column segment will store into the row group as a particular column. So it is nothing but the column segment is that column of data from within the row group. So this is the basic concept, that when you work with the column store indexes, that column store indexes will stored as a compressed like traditional indexes. Then how it is stored with the compress, it is stored in the form of row group, and each row group has a maximum of 1,048,567 rows, and each row group will contain one column segment. The column segment is nothing but the column of the data from the particular within row group. So there are multiple column segments, you can arrange them into the vertical column, and so by default at least the column segment should be available for each row group.